Sign it or you're blacklisted, the developer's son yelled, throwing the folder at my feet. I didn't argue. I just packed my tools, walked off the 31st floor, and withdrew my superintendent sign-off. In less than 24 hours, the panic started. I've spent 30 years in commercial construction. In this business, your reputation is the only thing that doesn't wash away in the Seattle rain. I'm a licensed professional engineer and a certified safety professional. When you walk onto one of my job sites, you notice two things. It's clean, and people aren't getting hurt. High-rise construction is a heavy, unforgiving business. A single loose bolt or a poorly secured rebar cage falling from the 30th floor can slice through a person like hot butter. That's why I don't compromise. 6 months ago, we broke ground on the Caldwell Tower. It was a 42-story mixed-use high-rise right in the middle of downtown Seattle. The contract was massive, $120 million. The project owner was Caldwell Development Group. The founder, Victor Caldwell, was an old school builder who had built half the skyline in the 90s, but Victor was semi-retired now. The day-to-day operations had been handed down to his son, Ryan. Ryan was 32, possessed a shiny MBA, and wore a pristine, unscratched white hard hat with premium Italian leather boots that had never touched actual mud. He viewed a construction site not as a complex assembly of human labor and physics, but as a spreadsheet that needed to be squeezed. Alongside him was his wife, Emily Caldwell, who served as the company's general counsel. Emily had a corporate stare that could freeze water, and she looked at our labor contracts the way a butcher looks at a side of beef, looking for parts to cut. I was the designated Superintendent of Record for the project. In Seattle, the Department of Construction and Inspections, or SDCI, requires a licensed superintendent to be legally responsible for everything that happens on site. My name was on the building permit. If someone fell, it was on me. If the concrete collapsed, it was on me. I took that responsibility seriously. My right-hand man was Raymond Vance. Raymond is 49, a veteran safety inspector, and the kind of guy who can spot a loose harness strap from 50 yards away. We've worked together for 15 years. Raymond and I had assembled a crew of 80 union ironworkers, carpenters, and concrete laborers. These guys were the backbone of the project. They worked 10-hour shifts in the wind and freezing drizzle, pouring structural decks and tying steel. The incentive that kept everyone focused was Clause 14.2 of our master agreement. It was a safety and quality bonus. If we reached the structural topping out of the building, meaning the roof of the 42nd floor, with 0 OSHA recordable injuries and passing grades on all municipal inspections, Caldwell Development had to pay out a 5% incentive bonus. That amounted to $1.2 million. Split among the crew, it meant $15,000 per man. For these guys, that was life-changing money. It meant paying off medical bills, fixing roofs, or putting money into a kid's college fund. With 3 weeks left before the topping out, we were on track. We had logged over 150,000 man-hours without a single reportable injury. Every weld was certified, and every concrete core test was coming back clean. The municipal inspectors from SDCI were routinely impressed by the cleanliness of our staging areas and the rigor of our fall protection systems. But Ryan Caldwell was facing a massive crisis. The project was running 3 weeks behind schedule due to unusually heavy autumn rains. Under the forward purchase agreement they had signed with an institutional buyer who committed to purchasing the completed building, missing the topping out milestone date would trigger a $5 million penalty. Ryan was desperate to claw back that time. He wanted to compress our concrete pouring cycle from a safe 7 days per floor to an aggressive 5 days. I told him it was impossible. You can't rush physics. The structural decks required 5,000 psi concrete. After we poured a deck, the concrete needed time to cure and reach its design strength before we could strip the shoring and fly the heavy formwork up to the next level. If you strip the support structures too early, the green concrete will sag, causing microfractures that compromise the structural integrity of the entire column grid. Ryan didn't want to hear about curing times. He saw the 5-day cycle as the only way to avoid the $5 million penalty. He started showing up at my trailer, pointing at his iPad and asking why we couldn't just use more accelerators in the mix. I explained that high early concrete mixes generate massive hydration heat, which leads to thermal cracking in thick structural slabs if not managed correctly. He looked at me like I was speaking a dead language. To him, I was just an expensive old relic standing in the way of his milestone. He and Emily started reviewing the project files, looking for ways to cut corners. They wanted that topping out milestone met to avoid the penalty, but they also wanted to avoid paying out the $1.2 million safety bonus. I started noticing Emily spending more time around the site, reviewing our daily safety logs and talking to the subcontractors. She was looking for any contractual leverage to claim we had breached our performance metrics. That was the beginning of the friction. The collaborative spirit of the job site was replaced by a cold corporate hostility. But I kept my head down, focused on keeping my men safe, and made sure Raymond documented every safety meeting, toolbox talk, and material delivery ticket with absolute precision. We were going to get our men their bonus, and we were going to build that tower the right way. Or so I thought. The tension boiled over during the concrete pour for the 31st floor deck. It was late October and a heavy Seattle fog had rolled in, making the air thick and cold. We had a tight window to complete the pour before the weekend. Ryan was pacing around the staging area, looking at his watch, and muttering to the concrete contractor about the delivery rate. Concrete is a science. If you want 5,000 psi strength, you need a specific water-to-cement ratio. If the mix is too dry, it's thick and hard to pump up 30 stories. It takes more time, more vibration, and more manual labor to get it to flow around the dense rebar cages. Ryan saw this as a bottleneck. He bypassed me and went straight to the concrete truck drivers, ordering them to add water directly to the drums before pumping. Adding water increases the slump, making the concrete soupy and easy to spread, but it destroys the structural integrity. It dilutes the cement paste, creating air pockets and reducing the ultimate compressive strength. Ryan figured the concrete would still cure close enough to strength and that we could slide it past the inspectors. Raymond caught it immediately. He was at the pump station with his testing kit performing a slump test. A standard mix should have a 4-inch slump. When Raymond lifted the cone, the concrete collapsed into a puddle. An 8-inch slump. It was soup. Raymond immediately ordered the pump operator to stop. He walked over to the delivery truck, grabbed the load ticket, and wrote reject across it in bold red marker. Ryan ran over, his face flushed. He demanded to know why we were halting the pour. Raymond explained the slump test was failing and that adding water was a violation of the ASTM C94 standard for ready-mixed concrete. Ryan scoffed. He said a little extra water wouldn't hurt, and that we were wasting $20,000 worth of concrete by turning the trucks away. He told Raymond to shut up and let the pour continue. Raymond looked at him, then at me. I walked over and backed Raymond. I told Ryan that if he poured this wet mix, I would not sign off on the deck. Ryan glared at us, but with the union crew refusing to touch the hoses without the superintendent's approval, he had to back down. He stormed off, but he didn't stop. Later that night, during the swing shift when Raymond and I were off-site, Ryan ordered the night foreman to pour the remaining sections of the 31st and 32nd floors using the diluted mix, gambling that he could hide it. But you can't hide the math. 7 days later, the laboratory sent back the results of the standard cylinder compressive tests. In our industry, we cast small cylinders of concrete during the pour and cure them in water tanks, then crush them in a hydraulic press at 7 days and 28 days to measure their strength. The 7-day break for the 31st floor came back at 2,800 psi. It should have been at least 3,500 psi to be on track for the 5,000 psi 28-day target. The deck was weak. If we continued building on top of it, the load would exceed the concrete's capacity, risking a catastrophic structural failure. Raymond brought the lab report to my trailer. A few minutes later, Ryan walked in, followed by Emily. Ryan looked nervous but tried to play it cool. He told us the lab report was a fluke and that we should just adjust the logs to show a passing strength so we could proceed with the next floor. I looked at the young man, astounded by his ignorance. I told him that falsifying engineering records was a federal crime, and that as a licensed professional engineer I had a legal and ethical duty to report these failing tests to the city. I told him we needed to halt all vertical construction, drill cores from the actual deck to verify the strength, and prepare for structural remediation. That was when Emily stepped forward. She didn't look at the lab report. Instead, she opened a folder and laid a document on my desk. She had drafted a notice claiming I was causing unapproved project delays due to insubordination. She argued that by refusing to proceed with the pouring schedule, I was violating my contract. She claimed that this insubordination and the resulting delays nullified the $1.2 million safety and quality bonus under Clause 14.2. I realized then what this was. They weren't just trying to speed up the project. They were active schemers trying to use legal loopholes to rob the crew of their hard-earned money to cover their own budget shortfalls and late penalties. I stood up. I told Ryan that I would not sign off on the structural integrity of the 31st floor, and I would not allow the crew to pour the 33rd floor until the concrete issue was resolved and the safety bonus dispute was retracted. Ryan's face turned from red to purple. He yelled that he was the owner, and he wasn't going to let an old dinosaur hold his project hostage. Emily stepped in, keeping her voice level and corporate. She told me that by refusing to sign off and halting the work, I was in material breach of my contract for insubordination and failure to maintain progress. She handed me a pre-prepared termination letter. She turned to Raymond and handed him one too. They had it all ready. Within 10 minutes, 2 private security guards hired by Ryan walked into my trailer. They escorted Raymond and me to our trucks, refusing to let us pack up our personal files. As I sat in my truck, watching the rain beat against the windshield, I looked at Raymond. He looked defeated. He said, "What do we do now, Tom? They're going to pour the next deck, pocket the men's money, and cover this whole thing up." I started the engine and smiled. "They think they just fired 2 employees, Ray," I said. "They don't realize they just removed the only 2 people keeping this project legal. Let's go see a lawyer." We met with our attorney, Clara Sterling, at 9 o'clock the following morning. Clara was a specialist in construction law who knew the Seattle building codes inside and out. She didn't waste time on sympathy. She listened to the story, looked at the photos of the slump test Raymond had taken on his phone, and reviewed the laboratory's 7-day concrete break report that Raymond had smartly downloaded before they locked him out of his email. Clara leaned back in her chair and smiled. She said, "The Caldwells think they're playing a game of leverage. They think you'll sue them for wrongful termination, which takes 2 years to get to a courtroom. By then, the building is finished, and they've sold it off." I shook my head. "I don't want a long lawsuit, Clara. I want the crew to get their bonus, and I want that building safe. How do we stop them now?" She tapped the lab report. "We don't sue them. We let the regulatory system do its job. First, Tom, you are the Superintendent of Record, registered with the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections, the SDCI. Under Section 110 of the Seattle Building Code, a commercial project of this scale cannot operate for a single hour without an approved, licensed superintendent physically present on the job site. You are the name on the permit. Since they fired you, we will file a notice of withdrawal. The moment the city database shows no superintendent of record, the permit is automatically suspended. I knew the rule, but I hadn't thought about how quickly it would hit them. Claire explained that as a licensed professional engineer, I was legally obligated to report structural safety hazards. If I stayed silent about the wet concrete on floors 31 and 32, the licensing board could strip my PE license for negligence. We spent the next 3 hours drafting 2 separate filings. The first was my official Notice of Withdrawal of Professional Responsibility and Structural Safety Retraction, which we submitted directly to the SDCI. In it, I formally stated that I was no longer the Superintendent of Record for Caldwell Tower and that I was officially withdrawing my engineering sign-off for the concrete pours on the 31st and 32nd floors. I attached the raw laboratory reports showing the failing 7-day strength tests and Raymond's logs detailing the unauthorized water additions ordered by Ryan Caldwell. The second filing was a whistleblower retaliation complaint under Section 11(s) of the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Act, along with a parallel state-level complaint under the Washington Industrial Safety and Health Act, or WSHA. This was crucial. By filing a formal safety whistleblower complaint before the Caldwells could try to sue us for contract breach, we established federal and state protection. Under the law, any negative action taken against an employee for reporting safety hazards is presumed to be retaliatory. It put a shield around us. We submitted the SDCI filings electronically at 2 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, when the union ironworkers and concrete laborers from Local 86 arrived at the site and learned that Raymond and I had been fired for refusing to approve the watered-down concrete, their shop steward immediately notified the union business agent. The union established a technical picket line. Under their collective bargaining agreement, union workers could not be ordered to work on a site that lacked a registered, approved superintendent of record or had an active safety dispute. The crew refused to pick up their tools. At 7 o'clock the next morning, the SDCI system automatically flagged Caldwell Tower as having no licensed superintendent of record on file. An inspector was immediately dispatched to issue an administrative stop work notice. When the inspector arrived and read my structural safety report regarding the failing 7-day concrete cylinder tests on floors 31 and 32, he realized the gravity of the situation. The inspector walked straight into the field office. Ryan, who was trying to convince a non-union replacement superintendent to take the job, was caught off guard. The inspector informed him that because the registered superintendent of record had withdrawn, and because there was a documented structural concrete failure on floors 31 and 32, the building permit was officially suspended. He walked out to the main gate and slapped a large bright red poster onto the plywood fence. In bold black letters it read, "Emergency stop work order. All operations must cease immediately by order of the City of Saddle." All work had to halt, and the site had to be evacuated immediately until an independent testing agency could verify the structural integrity. I was sitting in a diner across the street with Raymond, drinking coffee, watching it happen. We watched the last of the crew walk out of the gate. The site was dead by the second day of the shutdown. The financial pressure was mounting. A high-rise job site in downtown Seattle is a massive financial machine that requires constant cash flow. We had tower crane rentals costing $10,000 a day per crane. We had specialized concrete formwork leased from an international supplier. We had subcontractors demanding standby pay because their agreements guaranteed them compensation if they were kept on site but unable to work. But the real threat wasn't the daily overhead. It was the commercial bank. Caldwell Development Group had financed 85% of the tower's construction through a $90 million syndication loan led by Pacific Northwest Commerce Bank. Clara, our attorney, had obtained the public filings for the project's construction mortgage. The loan document contained a standard but brutal covenant, Section 9.4. It stated that if the municipal building permit was suspended, revoked, or contested for a period exceeding 5 consecutive business days, the borrower would be declared in technical default. During this 5-day cure period, the bank's risk management officers took immediate action. They suspended all loan draws, freezing the construction account. The progress payment for the structural steel package, which was due that afternoon, was blocked. Ryan Caldwell was in complete panic. He tried to hire a non-union superintendent to get the permit back, but the union crew refused to work under him, and other union superintendents refused to touch the project due to the active U.S.C. whistleblower investigation and structural concrete dispute. My phone rang at 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. It was Ryan Caldwell. He was screaming, calling me a saboteur and a parasite. He told me that his father's lawyers were preparing a $10 million lawsuit against me for tortious interference, slander, and breach of contract. He said he would make sure I never worked in Seattle again. I let him vent. Then I said, "Ryan, you should talk to Emily. Ask her what happens to a developer who files a retaliatory civil lawsuit against an engineer for complying with state safety reporting laws. It's called a slappy suit, and under Washington law, you'll end up paying all of my legal fees, plus statutory damages, before we even hit discovery." I hung up. Clara immediately sent a formal letter to Emily, detailing the statutory protections of our WSCA and OSHA whistleblower complaints. If the Caldwells filed a civil lawsuit against us now, it would be viewed by the federal government as direct retaliation, triggering immediate federal injunctions. Ryan tried to bypass the city's inspection by hiring a cheap, non-certified testing lab to perform core drilling tests on the 31st and 32nd floors. He wanted them to take core samples, compress them, and sign off that the concrete was close enough to 5,000 psi. But Raymond had already sent the official laboratory's 7-day test results to every certified testing lab in the Puget Sound area. No reputable testing firm was going to risk their national accreditation and their own professional liability insurance to sign off on watered-down concrete. 3 different testing firms refused to even send a technician to the site. By Friday morning, which was day 4 of the shutdown, the bank's independent structural engineer arrived to inspect the site. He reviewed my SDCI filing, looked at the failing 7-day reports, and immediately wrote a memo to the bank's loan committee. The clock was ticking down. The 5-day cure period for the building permit suspension would expire on Monday evening. If the permit wasn't restored by then, the bank would officially call the $45 million outstanding balance of the loan, and the Caldwell family empire would face immediate receivership. I spent that weekend at my house working on my yard. Raymond came over on Saturday afternoon. We sat on my back deck, drinking beers, looking at the gray clouds. "You think they'll fold, Tom?" Raymond asked. "They have to," I said. "Victor Caldwell built a reputation over 40 years. He's not going to let his son's arrogance destroy everything he has. He's going to call. And when he does, we're going to make sure the men get every single dime they're owed." The call came at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. It was Victor Caldwell. The old man's voice sounded tired, raspy, and stripped of the bluster his son had inherited. He didn't make threats. He simply asked if we could meet at Clara's office at 10 o'clock to settle the matter. I agreed, on one condition. Ryan and Emily had to be in the room. I wanted them to witness the bill for their arrogance. When we walked into Clara's conference room, the atmosphere was thick. Victor sat at the head of the table. Ryan was sitting next to him, his arms crossed, staring out the window, his face tight with anger. Emily sat with her laptop open, but she didn't have her usual smug look. She looked like a lawyer who had spent the weekend looking at a losing hand. Victor looked up at me. He nodded slowly. "Tom," he said, 30 years we've known each other. I should have known better than to let my son handle this. You're a stubborn bastard. But you're a good engineer. I'm an engineer who protects my crew and my license, Victor," I said, sitting down across from him. "Your son tried to compromise both." Victor turned to Ryan, his voice cold. "Shut the iPad off, Ryan. Listen to the men who actually know how to build things." Ryan winced but did what he was told. Clara laid out our terms. She read from a single sheet of paper. "First," Clara said, "Caldwell Development Group will pay the full $1.2 million safety and quality bonus to the crew immediately. Because of the bad faith attempts to withhold these funds, you will pay an additional $500,000 penalty to be distributed equally among the 80 crew members. The funds will be wired into the union escrow account by 3 o'clock today." Ryan opened his mouth to object, but Victor raised a hand, silencing him. "Second," Clara continued, "Thomas Cole and Raymond Vance will receive a severance payment of $500,000 each. This is to settle all claims of whistleblower retaliation and wrongful termination under WSCA and OSHA regulations. In exchange, they will sign a mutual non-disclosure agreement and withdraw their pending safety complaints once all funds have cleared." Emily leaned forward. "$500,000 each is excessive," she said. "We could fight the whistleblower claim." "You could," Clara replied. "But while you fight it, the building permit remains suspended. Today is Monday. The 5-day cure period for your construction loan default expires at 5 o'clock this afternoon. If PNW Bank calls your $45 million draw, your company will be in receivership by Friday. $1 million in severance is a cheap price to save your entire portfolio." Emily looked at Victor, then closed her laptop. She knew Clara was right. "Third," I said, speaking up, "Ryan is off the project. Completely. He doesn't set foot on the site, he doesn't talk to the subcontractors, and he doesn't touch the engineering reports. You will hire an independent third-party construction management firm, approved by the SDCI and the bank, to oversee the remainder of the project." Ryan stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "This is my project. Dad, you can't let them do this." Victor looked at his son, his face filled with disappointment. "You watered down the structural concrete of a 31-story building, Ryan," Victor said quietly. "You almost killed people, and you almost bankrupted this family. Sit down." Ryan sat, his face pale. "Fourth," I added, "Caldwell Group will pay for the full structural remediation of floors 31 and 32. You will perform high-pressure epoxy injection and install carbon fiber structural wraps on all affected columns and slab edges under the direct supervision of an independent structural engineering firm appointed by the SDCI. You will not pour another yard of concrete until that work is certified and approved." Victor took a deep breath, looked at the settlement document, and then looked at me. "If I agree to this, Tom, you sign the release to SDCI today so we can get the permit restored. The second the wire transfers are confirmed by our bank and the Union Trust," I said. Victor pulled a pen from his pocket. "Get the paperwork ready, Emily," he said. By 2:30 that afternoon, the wire transfers were confirmed. The $1.2 million bonus, the $500,000 penalty, and our severance packages had cleared. I signed the official SDCI release form, stating that I had reached a satisfactory resolution regarding the structural investigation, and that a licensed replacement superintendent had been properly registered. At 4 o'clock, the SDCI inspectors returned to the site and removed the red tag. The building permit was restored just 1 hour before the bank's loan default deadline. The site restarted the next morning. A reputable, veteran project manager from a major engineering firm took over. Ryan was packed up and sent to an empty desk at the family's corporate office, his reputation in the Seattle development community permanently ruined. Emily spent the next 3 months managing the legal paperwork for the expensive carbon fiber wraps that were applied to the weakened decks, a process that ended up costing the Caldwell family over $3 million. On Friday, Raymond and I drove down to the Union Hall. The men were having a barbecue to celebrate the safety bonus. When we walked in, the entire room went quiet for a second. Then 80 ironworkers, carpenters, and laborers stood up and started clapping. It was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. We stayed for a couple of hours, eating brisket and shaking hands. Several of the guys came up to us, showing photos of the houses they were going to fix or the medical bills they were finally going to pay off. As Raymond and I walked out to our trucks, the Seattle rain was falling again, cold and steady. Raymond looked at me, a big grin on his face. "So, Tom," he said, "what's the next project?" I unlocked my truck door and looked up at the sky. "I think I'm going to take a few months off, Ray," I said. "But whatever we do next, we're doing it by the book."